Hello, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon
I'm
Tessers,
Olivia Candosia.
and I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. And Olivia is an intern therapist. I want you to finish, graduate, and get your license just so I can stop having
Saying
that
that?
little addendum. Yeah, just
I
so
don't
we say
think-
we're both licensed therapists.
You don't ever say that I'm an intern therapist. You just talk about you though every intro. I've waited to hear if you're gonna say it. This is the first time I've ever heard you say I'm an intern.
Really?
Yeah, or one of the first. We'll have
That
to
is
go
not how I remember it.
fact check
And
that.
it doesn't matter like who is right or who is
No.
wrong, but it is different than how I remember it.
That's funny.
Memory is not something that anyone should rely on too confidently. No matter how confident you are in a memory, memory is a very imperfect process in terms of like memories accurately representing whatever happened,
Yes.
Just the video here. Yes, this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. One of which is that it is public and on the internet for everyone. What it is an open conversation. I'm here, Olivia's here, we're talking to each other and we're talking to you all. So until and unless we hear from you, which we hope to, we'll talk about the chat in a second, we're just doing our best to take into consideration and make our guesses about who you are and what you might be interested in hearing and how we're coming across to you and all that kind of stuff. And we do encourage you to participate in the chat for those of you who are willing and able to do so, because that gives us more information about you so we get a better idea of who you are and what you're interested in and what you're taking away from the things we're saying and so on. That can be questions and answers. It can be whatever. This is like all conversations, when humans pay attention to each other, they're impacted by the things that they observe in each other. So the things that we're saying and doing impact what you're thinking. The things that you put into the chat for us to be able to observe impacts what we think and what we do. And we'll just go where we go. Please do not feel like you need to stay on topic. That's not something that we do anyway. But even if we did, like, the point is for us to be here as a resource to anybody who is in attendance. And so we'd rather go, no matter what we're talking about, we'd rather shift onto whatever you all are thinking. Olivia and I can talk to each other plenty at other times, and we do. We are therapists with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, family, and group counseling services for people in the state of Illinois. Some changes will be happening along that front over the course of the year. Lots of changes coming. And we will keep everyone updated. But in the meantime, state of Illinois. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who can work with clients all over the world via the internet. And we try to do our best when people write something in the chat to read it out loud, because we are streaming on 3 different platforms simultaneously, and you'll only see comments from the platform you are on. So if you're watching us from Twitch, you'll only see the Twitch comments. So if someone comments from Facebook, we try to read it out so that you know what we're responding to. I think that's it.
I think so too. I'm sitting here like, okay, he's gonna ask you, so what do you want to talk about, or what's on your mind? What are you gonna say? And I just like, I don't know.
Well, what was on your mind?
I was like, well, you could talk about studying, but like, who cares? You could talk about staying on topic because that's interesting. And
You could talk about any of those things, but what was on your mind when you were thinking those things was the things that you just said you were thinking. Like preparing for the question.
I was.
Ask you.
And I've been doing that a lot lately, Brandon. I've been like laying in bed thinking about like conversations I might have with people and like saying out loud, or like literally like with future clients, with clients I have, with my friends, with you.
Is that new for you?
Anticipating
how a conversation might go?
The awareness of it is new. If I don't.
Well, that's good. I mean, one of the things that I'm always trying to do in therapy, one of the things that I think is beneficial for therapy, I would say that whether any given individual therapist identifies this as a priority or not, that this is universally a part of the benefit of therapy, is developing a person's skills in observing their own cognitive space.
Mm-hmm.
That like Like we talk about attention, you can only notice so much, right?
Mhm.
And of all the things that you could potentially notice at any given time, some of those things, some subset of that, is stuff that's in your own conscious space, your working memory, or whatever term you want to use. So we can pay attention to our own conscious space and see what's in there. What am I thinking? What am I feeling, etc. And at other times we're paying attention to other things, which doesn't presumably mean that there's nothing going on.
I'm thinking a lot about my thinking lately. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of like to me, that's what I'm saying, even if someone doesn't identify it this way, it's a universal therapy thing, that the very premise of therapy is I'm thinking about how I think and how I feel.
Yeah.
We're talking about how I think and how I feel, or what I think and what I feel. So by definition, of course, we're already working with people who have been paying attention to their own thoughts and feelings to some extent. B, the process of discussing those things just incentivizes those attentional processes to pay more and more and more attention to that stuff. One of the terms that gets used for this sometimes, and this term is like a lot of these terms, they get used in a lot of different ways, is metacognition.
Mm-hmm.
Meta meaning like thinking about your own thing, cognition about cognition, right? And there are people who argue that metacognition is the thing that we humans refer to as like maturity. The ability to observe what is happening inside one's own conscious space and to have some influence over how you then respond to those things, right? A lot of the other things would, like impulse control as an example. There's a lot of other things that, if not being exactly the same as what metacognition is, at least require in order to have impulse control, you have to be aware of your impulse. Otherwise, it just happens or doesn't happen or whatever. But same with emotional regulation. You have to be aware of your emotions in order to be able to try to influence either, depending on what people mean by it, either influence your emotions or influence your expression of and reaction to those emotions. So yeah, metacognition, it's a thing that I don't want to say it happens automatically, although I think that's fair enough to say in our modern culture. Like I don't think it necessarily happens automatically in the human mechanism or whatever, but it's not possible to be in our culture without getting more and more metacognitive as you grow up. And I do think of the role of a therapist sometimes as being as you start to pay attention to your own thoughts, it's like, whoa, this is all, it's a lot. So as with anything, yeah. So, when a child starts to be aware of their own thoughts and their own feelings, it's, what do you do with that, right? And so in some ways, I think of therapy as like, as a person is starting the process, or, at whatever point they're at in the process of paying attention to their own internal subjective experience, that just is like overwhelming. It brings up a lot. It opens up questions. It can be annoying, all these different things. And then we're people that help in that process of like, okay, well, here's what you want to do with that, right? Like help you to, it's kind of, I've used this metaphor before, that my experience as an actor when I did professional actor training was that at a certain point early-ish on, I couldn't watch a movie or a play without analyzing, because you start learning about this stuff and you start become aware of all of this stuff, and your awareness of that side, the names for things and the approaches and the techniques and terms and whatever, draws away from your awareness of the story, or being immersed in the narrative or whatever. And so it just feels like you're dissecting it all. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. When you first start paying attention to something new, it's like annoying and overwhelming. It feels unnatural. It feels like there's something you should be doing with all of this information, but you don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And then you need some help and some practice. Maybe I shouldn't say need. You benefit from practice and help and experience and skill development, and being able to identify, of all this information I'm now aware of, how do I sort through what of it is actually useful to get and what I don't need, and what do I do with the stuff that is useful, and so on. Anyway.
Yeah. What?
Go ahead.
I was just thinking about I'm trying to prep so much for stuff. Like that is what I'm noticing. It's like, okay, prepare for this conversation, prepare for this class, prepare for this exam, prepare. And it's so annoying. It feels like trying to get control. I don't know.
Well, that almost sounds like you're criticizing yourself for trying
Yes.
to prepare.
Yes, that's what's happening. Yeah.
Well, why? What's bad about trying to prepare?
I don't know. Maybe I'm like associating like I don't know that you should just figure it out and it'll be fine. You figure stuff out all the time anyways. Like why are you trying to prepare so much?
Right. And like you said, you figure stuff out all the time.
Yeah.
So your attempts to prepare don't seem to interfere with your ability to figure stuff out as you go along. Right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Just feels like a waste of time. It's just
Well, then let's address that because it's not a waste of time
yeah.
or any other resource. So I like genre fiction. I like sci-fi and fantasy novels and stuff.
Despite the possible downsides, every professional would benefit from acting classes, even if it's only to become more aware of what you feel as you interact with others. And on a tangent, I want to be known as Super Dad on Effective Relationship. I don't know if that's my dad saying that. I don't know if there's a way to like modify what
Looks like you're just gonna have to change your name on Facebook.
appear. Yeah.
Certainly something that could be looked into at some point when we have like an
That's fine.
actual like moderator doing something, assuming that day ever comes. No, acting classes are great. I really do genuinely think that like if someone wants to be a therapist, because you have to get a graduate degree in order to be a therapist, whichever of the 4 tracks you go, it all requires either at least a master's or a PhD. And for undergrad, acting is one of the undergrad degrees I would
That's mine.
suggest as mine too.
Mhm.
I mean, so obviously I'm biased here, but that and philosophy are probably the 2 that I would most suggest. I would not tell someone to do psychology,
Mhm.
which is what a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I almost feel, or I think acting classes should be mandatory for like everybody just to do at least once. But I just see so much benefit in it.
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say that acting classes, as things stand currently, are the closest thing that we have to communication classes,
Yeah.
like how to communicate with people classes. And I guess I shouldn't be so cavalier about that because I know there's a whole like field of study
Right,
called
speech.
communications. But in my mind, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but in my mind, what I understand the field of communications to be is like the study of communications, not just like how to interact with a person one-to-one, or like we're talking about mass communication and all these different things, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, to my knowledge, I think acting classes is the closest we have to like here's how to interact with a person, communicate with a person.
There's a couples therapy, drama therapy called Rehearsals for Growth. And I kind of love that title of Rehearsals for Growth. Like we're just rehearsing and practicing scenarios out.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the therapy world, there's a lot of like, especially over the past decade or so, a lot of social skills training things, various versions of that, social skills groups and DBT groups. And to address this thing, obviously being focused in neurodiversity, we talk a lot with people who identify as autistic and identify as having some social deficit or communication issues. There's certainly benefit to those things. And yeah, a lot of that is, I think, along the lines of just practice, right? Like, I don't know how you would do a social skills training of any kind that didn't involve some sort of role play, which is
Right.
fundamentally, we currently put that under the category of acting. Acting and philosophy, dual major, thinking actor, as opposed to the overthinking actor. Hey. Hi. Yeah, so I was saying that I like these sci-fi fantasy kind of stuff, genre fiction stuff, and I'm reading this series right now. One of the like major tropes across the board in fantasy novels is the idea of prophecy.
Mhm.
That like it's not required, but it's pretty rare to have some like fantasy property that doesn't involve some sort of prophecy, some sort of foretelling of the future.
Yeah, in my experience, a communication degree tends to be a mix of advertising, writing, and graphic design. All very useful, but not a lot about how to interact one-on-one.
Even a speech class, I feel that way too, because I remember taking speech classes, but it didn't really like teach you how to speak.
Yeah, well, all of those things, what is the neurodivergent trait of consequence
Yes.
would be associated with ADHD, I believe, whatever you're referring to. He's just typing it.
What?
Mr. Sir, this man want to ask you questions. Fire away.
We're ready for questions.
Yeah, so the thing about academics just across the board is the whole point of academics is to draw your attention to things which aren't immediately relevant
Sure.
to your real life right now.
I think we've seen comments like this before.
Yes.
Do you think Chop-Chin ranks higher on the Sigma scale, or does buying a property in Egypt book smacks you to being the group leader of the TikTokers party like the Blue Tie Kid? I wish I could answer, but I don't know what a lot of that is.
Nor do I.
I think that's the point of
Yeah.
the comment. I think that's intentional to use things that I'm not going to be able to follow very closely. I know some of those things, but I wish I could answer your question.
Communication and how that's a thing. that
Oh,
we
right.
do
So
well.
academics draws your attention to things that by the nature of what academics is are not directly relevant to your actual experience. So if you study communications or speech in an academic way, that draws your attention away from the actual environment, the people in front of you, and toward these abstract concepts and understandings of what makes for good large-scale communication or speech or whatever. You need to study more as a psychologist and gain a higher level of consciousness to understand this. Okay, fair, good to know. I will continue to study. Maybe I will attain that higher level. So yeah, you're then starting to think of like speech as like what makes a good speech. You know, what is the proper way to write a speech, and any attention you're paying to things like that is attention that isn't going to who's in front of you. That's why I think acting is the closest thing we have. Acting class is the closest thing we have because that's the one like field that you do study academically to some extent, but does involve a lot of like actually pay attention to this person right in front of you or these people right in front of you, listen, react, respond. I mean, teaching people how to listen and react is really useful.
I'm not here
To hate.
to hate. I love you, dog, your vibe, and I love what you do. I'm just here to troll. I respect that. I think that's, I don't have a problem with people trolling. Dig your vibe. See, you're using so much slang. I just assumed dog your vibe was like a positive thing that I didn't know about. Dig your vibe. I'm glad that you do, and I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your comments, trolling or not. Yeah, so I had an acting professor once say, you know, we study the history of theater and all these various things because colleges were started by lawyers and engineers and doctors. And so later on, when the arts wanted to tap into this like flow of credibility that colleges kind of created a market of, we had to come in and be like, you know, let's study our art in a very like scientific and historically oriented way. And he would always joke that like if the arts had started all the colleges and they had had to come join in later, they'd have to take classes like economics as expressed through dance.
I would do that.
So it's not something really that an academic environment lends itself to. That's part of why acting classes, even in college and whatever, are so different from, like, obviously there's not a whole lot of utility to a lecture class when what you're studying is acting. So there's a lot of, pretty much everything is structured around like getting on your feet and directly interacting with other people and doing scenes and all this kind of stuff, which is
Great prep for being a therapist too.
for sure. And very, very different. That was hilarious.
But like, he used my time in college to start a gambling circle. That I
I can respect that. You know, point of college for most people is to make some money. So, and then that was hilarious. Is the other comment. Anyway, yeah, I think there's value in that. There's like people will recommend taking improv classes if you're working on like social anxiety or like suggest that things like that have therapeutic value, and I think that they do. I think that things like that could be optimized even more, but that's the closest we've got to some things that are really great. And yeah, just practicing being in front of people, listening and responding. That's the thing about all other academics, including psychology, is that any element of my attention which is going toward something I've learned in that context, some psychological content or a framework or an analytical device or whatever, is attention that isn't going to the person in front of me. So that stuff I think is very useful, but I don't think it is specifically useful in the context of doing therapy, where what I would want is for a person's entire attention to be going to the therapist's entire attention to go to the client in front of them.
How does the S curve of innovation make you feel? How do you express the initiation phase through your body?
You know what?
Yep, there'd be a lot of that stuff. That guy was great. I'm blanking on his name right now. He taught, I don't know if he still does, he taught at Western Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Bill something. He did a lot with original practices, Shakespeare, which was super cool.
Mm-hmm. I loved any assignment where it's like, you could write a paper or you could make a video or you could do something creative. And even though the videos took so much more effort, I loved having to like figure out fun ways to. I have a great video on Jupiter, Brandon. It's got the Jupiter soundtrack. I like got in my neighborhood, a little boy in my neighborhood to act out as a little boy launching a rocket. I got my friend who had a great voiceover voice to record over it. Oh my God, it was so good.
That's great. I love it. And it's nice that class was structured in such a way to allow for that kind of a thing.
Yes. I'm thinking about how we could make a cereal box advertisement in one of my, I think like a history class, and of like a famous person. And I did Jane Addams in her whole house. And I remember decorating the box with my mom and being like, oh my God, this is the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. This is awful. And she's like, Olivia, it's fine, whatever. I don't know. This feels very vain talking out loud now. And then I brought the box to class and you could sing a jingle. And I did sing a jingle in front of everybody to get the extra credit.
Sure.
And I was so embarrassed because it wasn't like perfectly cut or whatever, but I was proud of that song. And then other people started bringing up their boxes. And to me, they were so boring and they were not exciting. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so now anytime I compare myself, my mom just says cereal box to me to remind me that I am so much harder on myself. But then that makes me feel like I'm better than people. And that's the whole thing I'm dealing with.
It makes you think that you think you're better than people,
Yes.
which you don't like.
Yes.
And you counteract your concerns that you might think you're better than people by making sure that you do not think you're better than people.
Yes, even though sometimes I do.
Sure.
Yes.
If I study psychology, can I use it to control my elderly neighbor's mind and scam them? I know that it seems like a joking question, but I have some sincere response to that. But there's a couple other comments. Not joking. The not joking movement is the breeding ground of new discovery. Law professors, accounting, sciences. My friend and I made a puppet show for a Mandarin class project in undergrad. Movement exercises at the beginning of class would yield greater learning and creativity
Yes.
and keep students awake. Yeah, it's probably true. Although the funny thing is, part of what I'm talking about is even the fact that we, even in jokes, think to like justify things in that way is evidence of what that professor was referring to, right? That like, in order to justify the movement thing, we have to utilize science and research to say like, see how this would benefit
Right.
you in something that you in a scientific way think is beneficial. So if I study psychology, can I use it to control my elderly neighbor's mind and scam them? This is the funny thing to me about psychology is that psychology, I think, is a very useful field. In the same way that I think like engineering is a very useful field, right? Like for those who are dedicated to it and do their work like really deeply in that category, they do some very useful stuff that is useful for the rest of us. But nobody walks around thinking that like, if I learn a couple popular engineering concepts, I will now understand my own like life and self better and accomplish the outcomes I want to make people feel the way that. And I get that those things are at least somewhat related to the idea of what psychology is. But even if we change it, right, like nobody learns a couple popular engineering concepts and it's like, and now I can build an engine. There are a few fields that tend to have this phenomenon where everyone thinks they're an expert in the field. And I think generally you can sum that up as people like to believe that they are experts in anything that they have experience with or personally interact with. So yes, everybody thinks that they have a lot of valuable thoughts on education because they went through school and they were in classes. Everybody who has children likes to think that they are an expert in parenting and parenting techniques and child development and so on. And everybody has thoughts and everybody has feelings, and so everybody likes to think that they're experts on psychology, which is fundamentally not what the field of psychology is. Just because you drive a car doesn't make you an expert in engineering. And I'm not trying to say this from like a gatekeeping perspective of, like I don't have a psychology degree. I want to be clear about that, right? I'm not trying to say this is like, oh, everybody's just amateurs that think they know a lot. What I'm trying to say is that psychology is a niche field. It is very useful for the things that it is useful for, and psychology is not at all about what happens for an individual person or what causes an individual person to think or feel or do one thing versus another thing. It's large scale studies. But unfortunately, the economics of the field and of academia really highly incentivizes publishing study results and research results as though they are directly relevant to an individual person's life. It's not just psychology that does this, it's pretty much everything. Because if I'm trying to get my article in front of as many eyes as possible, which there's obvious incentive to do that, financial and otherwise, then I don't want only people who are interested in who work in the niche field that I also work in to think that they can benefit from it. So I want to write something and put it out there as, are you a person? If so, you would be interested in this, And so they take large scale research results, again, not just psychology, studies show that eating some such and such chocolate a day will lower your risk of heart health or whatever, right? And you put it out there as though it's advice to individual people. But the whole point of what large scale research is that each individual case is far too unpredictable. There are way too many variables to make any prediction like that. That's why we need to get tons and tons of data to look at trends. But that's what ends up happening. And with psychology, especially, so much of it is filtered through the lens of like business and financial success and whatever, where it's like the one question to ask if you want to get people on your side or whatever, right? Like the one thing to avoid saying in arguments in order to move up the ladder or whatever. And so, as joking as it is, this idea of controlling my elderly neighbor's mind, like that is genuinely what a lot of people think psychology is, that if you learn these little psychology tips and tricks, then you can control your own thoughts and feelings and behaviors, which isn't true, and the thoughts and feelings and behaviors of others, or at least that your ability to control it gets better. I loved how that class had a bunch of options for projects. I got extra credit by singing a Cranberries song in Mandarin. Cool. So I get to be part of your show if I dedicate myself to studying psychology for the next 3 years. Maybe. I get that. Everyone thinks they're terrific engineers because they drive every day. Well, everyone thinks they're traffic engineers because they drive every day. Yeah.
I like to.
I like to. Yeah, we can be part of the show, I'm sure. You don't have to study psychology either. We can just set something up. That was part of the original concept for this stream, was to set it up so that people in the chat could we originally did it through a Zoom call and stuff, so that if someone was asking questions, we could say like, do you want to pop onto the stream and talk, almost like a call-in radio show.
Did you do that?
No, I never did that, but it's still a possibility. Psychology. Yeah, unfortunately, that misunderstanding of what psychology is causes a lot of problems for people, because it creates this idea, or at least reinforces this idea, that it is possible to control your thoughts and feelings and actions.
Like what people think therapy is sometimes, of like problems, like I don't know that
Yeah,
I have all the answers, or
like your story before, right? Of
Yeah.
the cereal box and your thinking, oh, it looks terrible.
Mhm.
Because what you're doing is you're comparing it against what you think is going to happen.
Right. Oh, I guess I've been doing it my whole life, Brennan, preparing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's not new.
Yeah.
Everybody does it all the time. Your awareness of it and
Yeah.
the way you're labeling it and therefore remembering of it is probably changing.
Yeah.
But doing it. So you have this idea that you're comparing against, and the worst is an undefined idea of what you're comparing against, which is very common, right? So this is where concepts like average or normal or whatever play big problems for people, is because is this good enough means how does this compare to like the average? You know, how does this compare to the baseline of what people expect because it is the most common thing or whatever. But we don't actually explore what our idea is of what we're being compared against or what we would be compared against. So it's just this nebulous thing. And as long as you leave it nebulous, it becomes better than what you have done, no matter what. No matter what yours is, you will just still be comparing it against something that is theoretically better. Because all you're really doing is looking at the flaws and the limitations, and that's fine. That's how you improve on anything, right? Is to say, well, this part could use this and that part could blah, blah, blah. But especially when it's something like that, where you're doing it for some particular specific purpose, in this case, a grade, right? It's really useful to actually think through, like, what do I really think the expectations are here? In other words, you were not paying attention at all to the actual assignment criteria.
Sounds like me again.
Right. Because you're not doing assignments as, I just have to meet the criteria for the assignment. You're like, what would be great? What would be cool? What would be effective and interesting and whatever? And that is not knowable. So you're doing an impossible thing. And that's okay, because a lot of these things, I try to make it clear sometimes. I talk a lot about people are trying to accomplish things that are impossible, and that causes problems. But it doesn't cause a problem if you know that it's impossible, because there are all kinds of things that are impossible, but the closer you get to it, the better you are, right? Like, I want to be a perfect father is not a thing that can be done. It's not even definable and whatever. But all the effort and all the resources I expend in pursuit of that goal, I'm glad that I'm doing that, right? Like, I'm glad that I'm moving in that direction and keeping my eye on it and prioritizing it. So same thing here, right? I want to make something that just blows people's minds. It's not something you can actually do. But the closer you get to it, the better off you are. It's just that it's hard to know when you're done if that's what you're doing. And that's why we need to make it clear that it's impossible.
Yeah.
Anyway. Oh, that wasn't enough.
I always found, because I was a preschool teacher for a bit, and I would have I wasn't perfect 2 Thursday.
That's my dad again. He switched over to
gotcha.
Twitch now.
I found myself having my assistants like cut out the shapes and like visuals for my classroom decorations, because that was just not my skill set of making things look pretty, or at least I didn't think it was. And I don't know, Brandon, what am I saying? I don't know what I'm saying anymore because of your face.
You don't know how to cut out a shape?
Eh,
They teach that in like preschool and kindergarten and stuff.
yeah, but it's never like, I guess I don't care as much about.
Yes, it was not a useful
Yes.
place for you to spend your resources
Yes.
as compared to what someone else could do.
Yes, if they had an enjoyable time doing it, great. I never had fun cutting out shapes because I would be like, ugh, I don't know. Who cares? I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm done.
Well, that's one of the things that people do often conflate, right? Is
Yeah.
that in order to justify that I am spending my time or my resources doing something other than this task, the only way to justify it is like, oh, that's not my skill set. I'm not good at that. You're better at that. When oftentimes it's like, no, I could do that too, maybe even better than you or whatever. That's irrelevant. The point is that the difference between what you can do here and what I can do here compared to the difference of what you can do on this other task we have to take care of versus what I can do, like, it's much more efficient for us as a team for me to do this and you to do that. And it doesn't have to be that like I'm not good at it. That's the only reason that I wouldn't have to do it myself. Because you're trying to accomplish the best possible outcome, but as everybody's doing, you're failing to take into consideration limitations. Finitude, the noun version of being finite, that you can't do everything. So it's not just a matter of how good could you accomplish, how well could you accomplish whatever particular thing. It's, is that the best place to put your resources versus whatever other thing you could do instead?
used to help cut out shapes for my second grade class. Those punch stencil machine things made me feel very adult. I'm thinking of, are you talking about those like big, like, like has like a grid, like slab of wood, and then there's a big like machete attached to the end, like
That's like
cut
a
through a bunch of
chopper.
stuff.
I think a stencil would be like almost like a cookie cutter chunk, and then it's like a little gingerbread man.
No, so especially since it says punch stencil, that makes sense. I just had never heard or seen.
Yeah.
I've ever seen one of those.
I don't know if I have either, but that's what my brain is seeing.
That sounds like a punch stencil machine. Sounds good. Yeah, this is all about just what's worth doing, what's worth trying, what is useful, not what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. And again, I know people will think that I don't like the word good or the word bad or those concepts, and that's not true at all. Those are obviously useful words and useful concepts. It's that they're not specific or precise, and that they refer to the way that a person views a thing, not some inherent quality of the thing itself. So when I'm trying to get people to swap away from using that to something else, it's because I want them to understand that what they're doing is talking about how someone views something, and that has now turned it into an impossible problem.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do the right thing in any like reasonable definition of the way, because different people will think that the different thing is the right thing.
Right.
And what makes something right is entirely whether or not a person thinks that it is right. So that's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
You can do what you think is right, and that can be a useful way of thinking about it, depending. It can also be a problematic one. The stencil was like a big piece of wood with like a cookie cutter blade and a spongy material. Interesting. That's cool.
That would feel very adult.
So what I was saying before about prophecy, this book series I'm reading right now, I like it a lot. And part of what it's doing is like playing around with this concept of prophecy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it's well established that nothing and no one in this universe, not even the gods and whatever, can actually see the future. That what everybody does is actually a version of what humans do by thinking, which is just are aware of all the possibilities or probabilities that could become the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between a human and a god is just in how many of those possibilities or probabilities they can consider or be aware of at any different time. But
and gods think more.
yeah, they have a greater capacity for like being aware of various permutations, right? Because we also have chains on chains. If it's like, okay, tomorrow I'm either going to do this or that, and if I do this, it'll either be this or that, and then if this, it's this or that, and so it branches off. But I like the particular way of one of the characters phrasing it that I just read yesterday, where they're looking at all these like prophetic images, these two characters, and one of them, who's been doing this a lot longer, reminds the other one. He's like, remember, they can be lies.
Mm-hmm.
They can all be lies. And the newer one says, but they can be true too, right? And the one who's been doing it longer says, the truth is just the lie that happened. Which is like one of the things that I try to communicate, and I like that way of framing it. Although obviously I have to give a lot of caveat around it. But yes, that's what quote unquote predicting the future is. What we do in thinking, we just tell stories about the future. And then stuff happens. And if whatever happens matches closely enough or overlaps with the story that we told, we say, I predicted the future.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it's just of all the stories that we're told, that one happened.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least whatever happened matches that story or could fall under the category of that story. Yes, this is Brandon Sanderson. It's Stormlight Archives, reading the most recent book, Knights of Wind and Truth. I don't know. I think it's helpful for people to understand that like all thinking is storytelling. It is not a perception of reality. It can be an abstract representation.
That's where getting an undergrad in acting is diminishing.
I don't know. I think actors are pretty good at storytelling.
No, I know that, but you've told me before, like, you tell a lot of stories, Olivia. Other therapists are here, she doesn't do that at all. And I was hearing like telling stories is like not a good thing to do.
You think I was saying telling stories is not a good thing?
Yeah, I thought.
Oh.
when you were having that conversation of like, she doesn't do that at all.
I said somebody else.
Yeah, she said
doesn't
Margaret
tell
doesn't do that at all. Margaret doesn't tell stories at all.
I don't remember the specific
Okay.
context, but that would have been about some particular specific thing.
Okay.
Because everybody tells stories. It's like the only thing we can do. Might I have been saying something like she doesn't have as much experience or like focus on being a storyteller? the
Yeah.
way that you have a background of like being a storyteller.
Yeah, but I was hearing my background of like making up stories is a bad thing
No.
and how it can diminish my work of like you're making up stories about a client or like you're telling yourself things about.
No, that's non-optional.
Yeah. All right.
The point I'm trying to make to everybody all the time is everything that every person thinks is a story. Right?
Yeah.
Like story is a concept that we have invented to try and communicate and conceptualize about what it is that we do.
Mm,
Even my perception of this chair is a story that my mind
Sure.
is telling about what this chair is.
I guess you did say I'm much better at it than you are. So that should have told me it's a good thing. I'm just kidding.
Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm good at a lot of things that aren't necessarily a good thing. And things are useful in the right context and when used in the right way. I've only finished Mistborn, but this sounds very Sanderson. I love his way of portraying big picture concepts. Yeah, me too. There's a reason that he's my favorite author, or has been for several years, that I do feel almost like a sense of kinship with him, like this similar approach of like everything that exists is cool and useful and exists for a reason. It's not about coming at things and critiquing that like this is bad and that's useless and whatever. It's about understanding and honoring that everything that exists has utility, and then also playing on top of that, building on top of that, playing off of it, right? Like utilizing tropes in ways that you're able to then make new and different points about things instead of just doing things the way that people have done them already.
You were talking to me a while ago about like getting back into reading fiction versus nonfiction, which has been a lot of my life as of late.
Yeah.
I can read this first. It's fine.
I want to tell Brandon stories. All will be made up. Remember, the truth is more challenging as we age. Remembering the truth is more challenging as we age. I think that's why the difference between dad jokes and grandpa jokes is that grandpa's lie.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. And I have not been reading fiction, but a soundtrack for the musical Epic came up on my Spotify, which is a musical all about the Odyssey. And I have been having the time of my life, like just living in this fictional world and like hearing these beautiful Greek names and hearing these like slashing sound effects and really immersing myself into it. And that is all I have to say is it's very fun to be in
Cool.
a story. And I don't know.
Yeah.
Yep. That's as much as I can do right now for getting into like reading a story. I'm just
Well-
listening to the soundtrack.
Okay, so here's one of the things that happens in therapy all the time, but also just generally, right? Is that because most people are approaching things through this lens of right, wrong, good, bad, correct, incorrect, right? That everything is either a good thing to do or a bad thing to do, a good thing to think or feel or a bad thing to think or feel, which is understandable. This isn't a criticism of anyone. That's how our whole culture talks about it. And there are intrinsic reasons that we tend to simplify things down and boil them down to that. Good and bad fundamentally is like the lowest, like most fundamental, essential way of delineating between two options. Is one is preferable, one is not, whatever, right?
My roommate brought that up as soon as she picked me up from the airport over the weekend. She's also getting into it. I'll have to look into it.
It's one of those things where like you listen to it and you're like, oh yeah, I can see why people make fun of musical theater music, but it's so fun because you just can like see yourself acting it out. It's so epic as the title like says.
All right.
Oh, it's so
Definitely
good.
will have to look into it. I did a Greek show one time and I loved it.
I did Trojan Woman once. It was great. Yeah.
So because everybody's coming at things through that lens, they think of everything as either good or bad, right? And obviously everyone's aware intellectually, at least, that like doing that in a broad way is impossible and problematic. To say something like, I don't know, sugar is bad for you or whatever, is a useful shorthand. It doesn't actually mean that like you would be best or better off if you ate no sugar at all. Nobody thinks that. Like it'd be a big problem if you ate no sugar at all, right? Or things that can be processed into sugar. So we know that it's about context and nuance, but we don't have the resources to spend to know the details of every little thing, right? So
What are you relating this to?
We're relating this to something that you brought up earlier is an example of it, but that's not actually the part I was
Okay.
to, where you were thinking that I was pointing out your storytelling is a bad thing.
Mhm.
But talking about how when we call attention to something, when we focus in or put someone's attention, like, hey, look at this thing,
Mhm.
people will automatically assume that that means that they have been wrong about whatever it is. So if it's something they think of as good, by calling attention to it, they think that we're saying that it's actually bad. And vice versa. If they think it's bad and we call their attention to it, they think that means that we're saying it's actually good. And sometimes people love that and they're like, great, I'm so glad to know that this is bad and I shouldn't do this and I should do that instead and whatever. And sometimes they get angry and defensive and whatever about it. So you were talking about this fiction thing, right? That I had talked to you about reading fiction. And then you finished that story by saying, like, that's the closest I can get to reading, a fiction story right now. As though that what I had been saying is it's good to read fiction and you should do it. And that you're like, hey, I'm moving in that direction, so that's good, even though I'm not all the way there and that's bad.
Yeah.
But so much of what we're doing, again, it's this metacognition thing. It's not about, no therapist, no person at all can actually predict the future, can actually tell you what will happen to you or to your thoughts or to your feelings or to your behaviors or anything else in your life or anything else if X or if Y or whatever, right? What we can do is help draw your attention to things because then we're arming you with more information, right? If I do like to think sometimes about like what it would have been like for prehistoric humans. Like there are these things that to us now are so like mundane and almost like difficult to even notice that for humans would. So the example I'm thinking of right now is storms, thunderstorms.
Okay.
That because of how we have things set up, both that we are largely protected from, like that they don't tend to inconvenience us really a thunderstorm very much at all. It's certainly not dangerous, except in very rare cases these days. We also know that they're coming in advance, or at least have like a good level of certainty about what the weather will be. We also have an understanding of what it is, why it's happening, what is the problem. I mean, like kids learn the water cycle in like kindergarten, But if you think about a prehistoric human, all that's happening is like sometimes with very little notice, if you get good at like watching and making connections about how the clouds and the air and whatever feel. But sometimes with very little notice, all of a sudden the whole world goes from like safe and you can do all kinds of stuff to very dangerous and you better not be trying to do any stuff. And you cannot plan in advance around that. There's a reason that like gods of storms and thunder and the sky and whatever are so big in our history, like our species history. And like now we barely think of that at all. Like what it would have been like for ancient humans to try and find clean water, not even clean water. That's not even a concept that they had. Just find water. And it's a thing we don't think about at all anymore. And we're thinking about all these other things instead. And the stuff that we are thinking about instead of these like practical things, it's all just stories, right? So I'm not saying that it's bad to think about stories or bad to I'm saying that storytelling is the only thing that there is when you're talking about language and cognition. And it's not bad for us to focus on cognition the way that we do, or to play around with stories the way that we do. There are many ways in which we can point out like direct, meaningful benefits of playing with stories. I'm saying when I'm trying to point this stuff out, when we as therapists or I as a person are trying to point these things out, it's not so that we help people understand that what they thought was good is actually bad or what they thought was bad is actually good. It's that we're trying to help people understand what is something beyond whether it's good or bad. And that's the point of making it that this is all just stories. That doesn't mean it's any different than what you already thought it was, right? Like thinking is what it was. Prepping, preparing for a conversation or studying or any other thing is still what it was, but it's also useful, I think, to be able to know like That's a story. You're telling yourself a story about what the test will be like.
Yeah.
You're telling yourself a story about what studying will do for you and what the results of that will be. That's useful. It's just that everybody has lost track of that, and we tend to think that you can actually predict the future, or you can actually know with certainty
Mhm.
what will happen or what is happening or whether something is the good or the bad thing to do. And because everybody thinks that that is the case, when you point out that no, that's not the case, let me take that back a step. Because everybody thinks that that is possible, but nobody actually does it, everybody feels bad about their failure to know things with certainty, to
Mhm.
predict things accurately. They think they're the only ones messing up. Like everybody else knows what people mean when they say stuff. Nobody else forgets stuff like I forget stuff. And this isn't to erase differences, there are differences, but that thought that like everybody else X or nobody else Y, that is not ever a true thought. Not in any meaningful way.
Sometimes though, I'll be like, anybody ever have this thought or think about this, and no one responds.
Yeah.
I'm just like, okay,
Because you put that idea out to all 8 billion currently
All of
living
them.
people.
every single one, Brandon.
And there's no possibility that you put it out and someone actually does sometimes think that, but either didn't hear what you said
Never.
or
No.
misinterpreted what you
People-
said
Yeah.
or just didn't want to respond in that scenario for some given reason.
God, I've been that person where I relate to something, but I don't, especially online.
Yeah, well, the story you just told is one that ends with you being embarrassed that nobody else is like, yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So you're already setting up that you're referring to a context in which being someone that acknowledges that you think a thing is theoretically embarrassing.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, in those scenarios,
Yep.
people are less likely to say stuff.
Yep.
There's a difference between what people say and what they experience, you know. But anyway, yeah, it's just people think that perfection is possible. They know they're not perfect, so they feel bad about themselves, and they think everybody else is perfect. They know intellectually they're not if you call their attention to it, but there's this default way of thinking which is just like, yeah, what I'm comparing myself against is perfection at all times. So anything I fall short on is bad, and everybody else doesn't struggle with it. And then when we first start pointing out, like, yep, no, that's the best you can do. You can't be perfect or whatever. At first, it feels like it's a confirmation of this thing. Like, yep, you are deficient. You are limited in some unusual, inhuman way, or
Mhm.
pathological way, or whatever. And then we have to try and connect that, because what people want is to be perfect. Tell me what's the right thing to do so
Right.
that I'm always happy and that I'm not sad anymore, whatever. And that's what everyone's looking for. Because of course, if that's possible, like I would want it too.
Right.
Who wouldn't want? That's the whole point of what it means to be perfect. It's like everything that you want all the time. So we can't do that. We can do things that maybe get us closer. And I would argue that one of the things that will get us closer is what I'm saying right now, helping people to understand that that's not real.
Mhm.
It's something you aim for. And the entire point of the concept of perfection or good or right is that we can, or at least it is useful to put things on a spectrum where right is on this end and wrong is on this end, or good is on this end and bad is on this end. And all we're doing is just saying of like all these possible things that happen or could happen, you know, some of them are closer to what we would prefer all the time and some of them are further away from it. You don't get to the ends. That's what the concept is labeling the end. So the more right you are, the less wrong you are. The more good you do, the less bad you do. Like those are good things. Those are desirable, beneficial, useful things. But if you think it's possible to do it, then you just feel terrible all the time about your failure to do it. So we have to point that out to people. And at first, people will often respond as though that means that they are indeed stupid the way that they have always worried that they were.
Mm.
They are incapable the way that they were always worried that they were. Because nobody thinks that that's true of other people. No matter what you say, right? Like, you know, other people also struggle with X. Oh yeah, well then what about this person who doesn't struggle with it? It's like, well, even if that person doesn't struggle with it, that's not evidence that nobody struggles with it. Also, you have no idea if that person struggles with it.
Mhm.
But that is one of the most common responses is you'll say like, I'll say something like, no, when it comes to writing assignments, you actually should not. It is not beneficial to start them early. And I'll point out, like, do you know anybody that starts them early? and people cling to like, I know this one person this one time that started things early, that means it's possible and therefore I should do it.
I remember, yeah, I said something and you're like, where'd you hear that from? And I said books, and you're like, what books? And I like could not give you one book that I had heard a thing from.
Which isn't to say that you haven't heard it.
Right.
Right. Like I would answer that too with I'll say all kinds of things where it's like, I heard this, and if someone were to say specifically, where'd you hear it? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Maybe I'm even wrong, but I'm referencing the memory of having, like, I encoded that memory as I heard it somewhere. But that's also an example of what I'm talking about, where when you ask somebody for that, they think it's a challenge. Like, if you remember and can cite the scholarly article that you referenced for this, then I will accept it. But if you can't, you're an idiot and you shouldn't have said that thing.
Yeah.
Which is not at all the point.
And yet.
The point is to just get information.
Mm-hmm.
This is like, show me. Oh, wait.
Other people struggle? I don't believe it. Impossible. Show me evidence. I like that.
I had someone tell me, I'm not trying to self-sabotage. And I'm like, yeah, me either. Like, I'm not trying to do that either. It just happens. I just thought it was funny.
Yeah, no, well, to jump in, but at risk of, this is the thing, right? If I call attention to something,
Oh, no.
then the immediate response is like, oh, so what I did was bad or what I did is wrong. And Brandon has a problem with it. That's why.
But no, I'm calling attention because I think it will be helpful to call attention. Here's one of my general rules. Any phrase that has like self hyphen attached to the front of the word, that is a thing a person cannot do for themselves.
Mm.
If it was inherently a thing that a person can do for themselves, then we wouldn't need to add self with a hyphen onto the front of it.
Like self-confidence, like
Yeah, self-care, self-esteem.
Okay, say more.
What we're doing with all of these self-love, all of these terms, all of these ideas are things that one person does for another person, right? And then what we do is we anthropomorphize different aspects of ourselves, turn different aspects of ourselves into separate individuals, is a way of saying, well, I can certainly provide this for myself, right? I don't need anyone else to love me if I love myself, which is absurd.
Okay.
The thing, even if that is in some like abstract way true or accurate, which it isn't, but even if it is, all that means is you're applying language to a different set of experiences than it was intended originally to apply to. Loving yourself does not in any way replace or mimic or duplicate what we mean when we say someone else loves me. That doesn't mean that whatever you're describing as self-love isn't a beneficial or good thing. It very likely is. But to use that term, we're saying it as though it is the same as what somebody else does. No, sabotage is not a thing that a person can do to themselves. So when somebody's talking about self-sabotage, what are they really talking about?
God's my friend does that all the time. I love him to bits, but he also can get pushy for me to cite my sources in the middle of a conversation when I've been clear I don't remember it. It can get exasperating.
What is self-sabotage then?
Yeah, what are we saying when you say I'm self-sabotaging? Because what does sabotage mean in this context? Yeah, I'm causing myself to fail. I'm interfering with something that if left alone would result in success, but I'm interfering with that thing in such a way that now it no longer does, now it fails instead. So right there, it's presuming success, right? That the only way that I could potentially fail at anything is if I actively interfere with myself, because if I just got out of my own way, I would succeed at everything automatically. Where centering success is the thing that is automatic and easy, and failure is the thing that you have to work to achieve. But also, if you're sabotaging yourself, where did the impulse or the desire to sabotage yourself originate in the way that we're talking about it? Right? What do people mean when they say self-sabotage? What are they saying, prompted the sabotage? By definition, it's not that I consciously chose to do this, right? Because then it wouldn't be self-sabotage. That would just be I decided I didn't want to do it or whatever.
Yeah.
So what are we saying?
I don't like this term.
We're talking about what people generally refer to as the subconscious, but people can use different terms, but this idea that there is some version of you, some part of you
Mhm.
that is secret to you. You yourself cannot observe it consciously, but it also doesn't exist in a way that anyone else could observe either. So it's just a hypothetical part of you,
Mhm.
and that part of you has different and sometimes directly opposing desires than your conscious desires. And that when that is the case, that part of you, at least sometimes, wins.
Mhm.
I consciously, I really, really want this thing. I'm doing all kinds of stuff to get this thing. And then something happens and I don't get the thing.
Mhm.
It's like, wow. Despite the fact that that I had all kinds of thoughts about it, I know I wanted it, and I did all this stuff to try and get it, there's some other secret part of me that didn't want me to have it. And that part ruined everything for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
It has more control over what happens in my life than my conscious thoughts do. And there's some truth to some of that. Like, for example, the fact that our conscious thoughts are much more limited in their ability to control what happens in our life than we would like to believe. But the other part of it is absurd. It couldn't possibly be that things didn't work out for things other than that you secretly made it happen.
Right.
You're the only thing that impacts whether or not things go the way you would want it to go. So if it doesn't go that way, you made it happen.
Right.
That's a very comforting story to tell yourself, because hey, I'm in control of everything. And if I can just figure out how to get out of my own way, I'll have everything I want. But that's absurd. So it's comforting in the moment, but it hurts you the rest of your life, because now you believe that you are being controlled by some part of you that you have no access to or control over. There's nothing you can do about it. And every failure you ever experience is your fault. And it could have been a success if only you had figured shit out. It's awful.
It's awful.
Yes.
Yeah. That's not fun.
That's why I gave the initial general rule of anything that has self hyphen at the beginning is a thing that a person cannot do for themselves
So
by definition.
can we do a self-love exploration then on the
Sure.
opposite end? Can't do self-love.
Well, we can do things that we are terming self-love,
Uh-huh.
but the things that we're referring to when we say self-love is not the same as the things that we're referring to when we say love.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
So, fine, but why not just call that stuff other stuff? Why call it self-love as opposed to,
What would you call it instead, Brandon?
well, it depends on whatever specific thing we're referring to. The category of things that, we could
Yeah.
say fall under the description of self-love is
So big.
it's really anything that you like or benefit from. We can say having that or having more of that or doing more of that is self-love.
Mm-hmm.
So why not just call each of those individual things whatever the individual term for it is?
Mhm.
Why encapsulate it under this idea of self-love? Why is it useful? And again, I'm not saying it's not.
Mhm.
We wouldn't do it if it wasn't useful to people. Generally, it's useful as justification that it's this the concept of motivation, what most people mean by that is if I feel bad about something, that makes me do good things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I call not checking email after work hours, right? If I call that self-love, all that means is I don't want to check my email after work hours. I think it is in some way bad for me or detrimental or whatever for me, not a good return on investment, whatever to check with. So I don't want to do it. But now I've called it self-love, which means if I do check my email after work hours, how do I feel about myself?
Not too great.
Yeah, I don't love myself. I should love myself. So now I feel bad.
Yeah.
It's just a way of taking something and making it so that we will now feel bad if we fail to do that thing in some way.
It makes me think of my friends who had to, on their spring break, write a paper about how they implemented self-care into their spring break.
Yep, self-care,
A
self-hyphen.
paper. Yeah.
Who is it, by the way, predominantly that pushes the language and the concept of self-care? Where do you hear about self-care the most? where do people in our culture generally hear about self-care the most?
Where? In the, I was going to say self-help industry, self-help books, which is hilarious.
Because help is also not a thing a person can do for oneself.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have to put that on there.
Hmm. I'm also thinking woman, and I'm also thinking places. I don't know.
Places where was the one you were just referring to? That these friends of yours were required to think about.
Oh,
about
in
self-care.
the helping industry.
Well, sure, but specifically in school, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's school and it's work.
Yeah.
It's when a person is a member of an organization,
Mhm.
the organization pushes this concept of self-care.
Yeah.
Why?
Because they ain't giving it.
Yeah. Because I just need you to keep showing up every day and doing what I'm asking you to do. If you can't do that for whatever reason, then you have failed to take care of yourself.
Mhm.
If you burn out, that's because you didn't do self-care right. So I'm telling you to do self-care because we cannot question whether or not what I'm asking you to do is an appropriate amount of things to do. It obviously is, or I wouldn't ask you to do these things. So it is sustainable and beneficial and viable, all these things, as long as you do self-care correctly. And if I am experiencing lots of people having a hard time continuing to do what I'm asking them to do sustainably day after day after day, then I become very concerned about self-care. Hey, you all need to take care of yourselves better. Not I need to pay you more or cut back on your responsibilities or provide more support or any of that other stuff. To be fair, sometimes companies will accompany talk about self-care with like, and here, we're granting you these extra days off or this extra
They'll have a
funds for
massage
whatever,
chair for one day.
which is better than
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, self-care. Anyone talking about? Here's a really cynical and awful way to put it, but it'll stick, I'm guessing. Anyone telling you that you should have or engage in self something is just a person who doesn't want to give you that thing.
Mm.
If I'm telling you to engage in self-care, I just don't want to care for you. If I'm telling you to look up some self-help stuff, I don't want to help you.
Even if the person verbalizes like, but you can reach out to me, whatever. If you want help, then also self-care. I'm thinking of a teacher.
I like I said, the way
You're
I'm
general,
putting
yeah.
it is awful and over the top.
Yeah.
Because in reality, it could be like the extent to which I think help would be beneficial to you is past the extent to which I am interested in or believe that I can provide it for you. But even in that case, I can tell a story about it that makes it sound really selfish and terrible, where it's like, I feel bad about how things are with you. I don't like it. I would like things to be better with you. I don't believe that I have any ability or information or capability to help you to make it different, or I can only help you to such extent and I want it to be more than that. And then I comfort myself by explaining away the rest of that gap is like, certainly it's possible. Just, go figure it out. You can figure it out. There's resources. We're trying to do things that are impossible. One of the things that's impossible. Life is pain, highness. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. Yeah. That's Princess Bride, right?
Pain, highness. Oh, like
Highness.
highness,
That's they're talking to a princess.
Your
Life
highness.
is pain, highness. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. Is that Princess Bride? I think it's Princess Bride, but I could be wrong about that. Yep, Wesley. Yeah. Again, language will tell you this stuff if you pay close enough attention to it. If you have to add self on to the beginning, that's a modifier. If the concept itself already entails the possibility of one doing it for oneself, then the word doesn't need to be modified. We're modifying it to say, like, this is like help, but you do it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
This is like care, but you do it for yourself. And it's not that they're not like these things in some way, but that's not just before they jumped on the hillside.
I'm just trying to think of other words that go before the self words that come after that people use.
Self-criticism, self-loathing, we can be good ones or bad ones, right? Self-regulation,
self-efficacy,
Mhm.
all kinds of things.
Hmm.
But to be clear, the rule I gave is not actually 100% foolproof, right? Like sometimes what we're doing is the word that's getting self added onto the front is a word that describes an evaluation of something. Like,
Self-evaluation.
yeah,
Self-conscious. Self-centered.
oh, okay, self-conscious. That's a good one.
Thanks.
Thanks, Fast Insider. Because self-conscious, in that case, what we're saying is you are conscious of yourself.
Mhm.
So that's just describing what is happening in your consciousness instead of just about the self. So sometimes these words are just saying like, whatever the word is, you are doing it about yourself
Like
or in
self-aware.
regards to yourself. Yeah,
Mhm.
self-aware, stuff like that. But the context in which we were talking about it and in which this usually comes up when I'm saying something like this is we're talking about like pop psychology terms and those ones generally. Even things like criticism and evaluation are things that are done by an outside entity to something.
Mhm.
But yeah, some of them is just describing what is in your consciousness. Self-indulgent, indulging yourself, sure. That one
I like
actually, that would fall under the category of like, by its nature, it does not apply to the self. That's why we have to
Indulgent?
Yeah, because when you're indulging something, like you indulge somebody, you give in to all their whims and provide them with everything that they would want. So it's still like you're doing something for yourself.
Indulge yourself.
Imagine it as like, in order for this concept to apply,
Mm-hmm.
do we have to think of you as at least two separate people, one of whom is doing something for the other one
Mm-hmm.
or to the other
Sure,
one or whatever. So there are some where it's not that, like self-conscious.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no. That one I guess would still be because we're saying you are conscious of yourself. So we're kind of
Messed
phrasing
up
it to
branding.
people.
My head hurts.
Mostly this doesn't matter, especially with all these other ones we're coming up with right now. This is just fun.
Hang on, I have a question. Okay, so the brain, I'm in a psychopharmacology class right now.
Sure.
And my teacher's talking about how the brain doesn't have pain receptors. But when people say my head hurts, they're like, oh, my neurons are just firing or whatever. And she's like, no, it's just your like vessels are either like, constricting or expanding. How come though, when I'm thinking and talking to you, my head hurts all the time? What's happening?
Well, hurts is a word that we use for lots of things,
Mm-hmm.
not just what we would strictly identify as the sensation of pain. We say all the time, like, oh, my heart hurts, when we don't
Sure.
literally mean I have a sensation of pain. So that's one possibility, is that you're just expressing some.
No, there's physical.
We do have headaches, right? Like all the
Yeah.
time. That's not pain in the brain.
I guess I'm wondering the cause and effect of like talking to you and thinking a lot makes my head hurt.
Okay. That's a very interesting and I was going to say surprisingly, but it's probably not surprising. Very complex thing, but super useful
Uh-huh.
because it can be a lot of different things. So for one, cognition is not free, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking requires resources in the same way that moving does. Different resources, a different system is being utilized. But anything that a person does, A, you have to have a system in place to allow you to do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
B, some catalyst has to be in place in order to spark the use of that system. C, some fuel is consumed in the process of that system activating and doing whatever it does. D, the system is damaged to some extent, or at least worn down to some extent by that use. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah.
So everything that we do takes all these resources in all these ways. Even if we're never experiencing, let's say, pain, for example,
Mm-hmm.
we are still spending resources on building and maintaining the nerves that allow us to theoretically feel pain
Sure.
when it were to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So even when you're not using something, you're spending resources being able to theoretically.
Great.
And then when you do use something, you're using resources that I'll come back to the catalyst. You're using resources in the fuel that is being used in order for that
Mhm.
system to activate. And you will
have to use resources in order to repair the damage, do
Okay.
the maintenance of whatever happened to that system.
Mhm.
The catalyst is a little bit different, but something happens and we respond to that thing by doing whatever we're talking about doing here. Thinking is the example we're using right now, but something happens and we respond to that by thinking.
Mhm.
Whenever consciousness is involved, whenever thought is involved, kind of what we're saying is that the thing that we're responding to, the thing that happened, that in response to that thing we do something, is the thought. We had a thought, and in response to that thought, my body did this thing, which is the most useful way to think about how we can, quote unquote, control ourselves. That's why I try to teach people to talk about it as influence rather than control, because all we do is we can prompt ourselves. We have a thought, and then that thought prompts some response, right? So thinking is a thing you can do, and it requires resources for all those reasons. So in terms of like a person's head literally hurting after thinking a lot,
Mhm.
this is way oversimplified, partly because it's just, we don't need to get into the complexity, and partly because I don't have the details on like the full, I could talk about it in more complexity than this, but I don't think it's worth it. Thinking requires sugar and water, I think is the simplest way to put it. And feeling in the terms of like conscious feeling, so that includes all emotions, but also just being aware of your feelings and perceptions, right? Like, you know, until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, you are not aware of the chair underneath you, and you just became aware of the feeling of the chair, right? That once you become aware of it, that means cognition is now involved in that process. People talk a lot about like neurotransmitters, right? Serotonin and dopamine and all these things, right? Well, those neurotransmitters, your body has to make them in order to have them on hand to be used when the time comes. Generally, again, oversimplified, but they're made out of amino acids, so protein largely. You don't need enough protein, then you're not going to have as many neurotransmitters on hand to be letting out there. And the thing that they move through, again, oversimplifying, is water and uses up water. This is why when you are having a very like intense emotional experience, you will get dehydrated. When you're thinking a lot, very deeply, you'll get dehydrated. Your mouth will get dry. You know? So some of the pain that can happen from thinking is literally that you become dehydrated, you're low on sugar, you're experiencing the results of having depleted some things in your body. Another way of talking about, or another version of what we would refer to sometimes is like, my head is hurting or whatever, is this perceptual thing. And there's all kinds of debates about this.
Mm-hmm.
But here is like something that's generally accepted by pretty much all sides of the debate, right? Is that, let's take as an example, I'm working on a very complex math problem.
Okay.
Just because that is a thing that almost everybody will say, like, sure, that involves a lot of thinking. Whatever. And everybody knows that if you're working on a very complex math problem or just doing math or whatever, every moment you feel less effective than the previous moment, right? That in minute 15, you got less in you than in minute 1, right? And you can only do it so long before it's like, I just can't focus on this. I can't keep thinking. So there's kind of this curve that happens where like early on when you're doing something is when you're most like, okay, you're not even, in most cases, like the vast majority of cases when you first start on something, you're not even aware of evaluating your own performance on this thing. You're just doing the thing. At some point you start to become aware of like, I don't know that I'm doing a good job, or maybe if I took a break or whatever, then it gets worse and worse and worse. And eventually you just cannot get yourself to do it anymore. Your mind will go to other things. Everybody knows that. There's all kinds of debates about what is happening there. But again, generally agreed upon that whatever the mechanism of why that happens, the purpose of it is that it is useful information to have. That like we should have a growing impulse over time to move on to something else or consider something else, because there is an inherent truth to when we're engaged in a cognitive activity. The longer we spend on that, the less likely it is that we are going to make any progress on this by continuing to spend resources on it.
So we have an incentive to get us to focus on other things and do other things that builds and builds and builds over time. That's agreed upon. What the mechanism is different, but that's the other thing, right? So you could have some pain literally just from like overuse of systems, overusing water to the point of dehydration, or but then the other thing is that you have this growing sense of like, continuing to think is not a good idea for me right now. It's not working so well. I should do something else. And that is a perception. What that perception originates in is up for debate, but that perception grows over time. That's also part of what we're referring to when we say my head hurts.
Yeah.
It's similar to being like, I'm really tired. I can't focus on this anymore.
Uh-huh.
Again, that version doesn't usually involve actual pain.
Here's this fun thing. Humans have an ability to make things which weren't originally painful,
Mhm.
and vice versa. Because pain is a sensation that we generate for ourselves.
Mhm.
And everybody, I think, again, knows this to some extent, right? That like there are certain kind of pain that isn't painful to you anymore.
Mhm.
Like a common version of that is being sore the day after a big workout.
Mhm.
It's pretty common for people to be like, ooh, that's sore. And like you kind of almost like activate it on purpose throughout the day, and it has this like sweetness to it.
Mhm.
Even though it is like biologically your pain receptors and whatever firing, we receive it not as like, oh, pain, I shouldn't do that.
Right.
It's like, oh, I like it kind of.
Mhm.
Obviously, there are other versions of this, and we can go in different directions where pain becomes an enjoyable thing, a
Mhm.
sensation of pain. Vice versa, we can get ourselves to start producing a sensation of pain for ourselves in response to something which is not inherently painful.
Mhm.
Again, like a common example of this would be like tickling.
Mhm.
Like the point of being tickled is that it isn't engaging pain sensors. It isn't providing the physical stimuli that would get your pain sensors to fire. But it does cause like emotional and cognitive distress, overload, whatever. And over time, we can start associating that enough that it starts to feel painful.
Continuing to think is definitely a bad idea for me right now. Well, good thing to note is that I would like to stop thinking for a while. Unfortunately, that's not possible. But there are things that are possible that is likely what you are referring to, but by the literal definition, it's not possible to stop thinking. Here's what it tells me more than anything, or suggests to me more than anything.
What it?
Your head hurting when we think a lot is when a person has encoded that if something is good, they should do it as much as possible, which is what pretty much everyone has encoded about what good means. Anything that is good is something that should be done as much as possible. And therefore, the only reason to stop it is what?
Say that again. Sorry.
If something which is good is something that you should do as much as possible, the only reason to stop doing it would be what?
It is bad.
Well, that. Or because you can't anymore. It's no longer possible.
Yeah.
You've reached the limit of how much you can do. And depending on how you encode what it means, what counts as I can no longer do this thing,
Mm-hmm.
in particular, that it is pain or depletion or incapability or whatever, then you're now incentivized to perceive yourself as being in pain or depleted or incapable
That's true. You do prove
earlier
me
and
wrong.
earlier.
Because my head hurt probably 45 minutes ago, and it still hurts, but I'm still here. Still.
Yeah.
Getting
Well,
through.
that's not, I don't like you thinking that that's me proving you wrong, because that is not a thing I'm trying to do. Also, it's not wrong. That's, again, what I'm pointing out. It's a story.
Yeah.
Right? Are you actually incapable of thinking? Obviously not. You're
Mhm.
continuing to think. That doesn't mean like, haha, see, you can still think, and therefore you should continue to think.
Sure.
That means that there is a point, there is a purpose for us to feel as though or think as though it is true that we can no longer think, even when that isn't actually the case.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when we talk about things like this, when I've used the metaphor of like there's how much money is in your account and then there's how much money the app reports to you, and those are separate things, that people will often respond with like, I wish I knew exactly how much was in there and didn't have to rely on my own sense of tiredness and whatever. And no, there's a reason we don't know that.
Yeah.
Like,
That'd be scary. Oh, I don't like that. If I knew exactly like how much I had to think before.
Scary.
Like,
If you had a counter of how much more you can think before you die.
yeah. Or like how
I suppose it'd be scary if it happened all of a sudden, but if like that's how we worked our whole life,
sure,
we just
yeah.
would have known it. And we have something like that. It's called tiredness, and like the version of it that happens as you get close to death is just not something you have experienced, but that theoretically you will someday if you die in a certain kind of way.
Right.
You know, which is the hope, is that you die in the kind of way where you get tired and tired and tired
Right.
until it happens.
Fingers crossed.
That's what I'm hoping for. Yeah, it's the reason that would be bad. Imagine that you like run a company, and this company has like many different branches, all of which are important and rely on one another and need to work together, right? There's the sales, and there's the product development, and there's the customer service, and there's all these things that we need all of these things to function in order for this company to do what it does and continue to persist. You, if you're the one running the company, would be aware theoretically of all the resources available to use in that company. But the point of having all those different departments is that each of those departments is focused on its thing, and therefore prioritizes its thing. Sales thinks that sales is the most important thing, and that's good. Things work best when that's what sales thinks. And things work best when product development thinks that product development is the most important. But if you were to tell sales, this is the entire available budget for the company, right? If you were to tell product development, this is the entire available budget for the company, then those people are not, by the nature of what their job is they're not balancing out like what other departments are going to need. All they're going to focus on is like, well, give me more of this and I can do more. Give me more money, hire more people, will sell more and whatever. In reality, right, in real life, people would understand, like sales would have some understanding that other parts are necessary. But to whatever extent you're asking a salesman to be aware of the fact that product development also needs money, you're detracting from the resources that they're spending focused on their task. So ideally, we don't have people who are thinking about like, oh, well, other people need resources and whatever. That's the whole point of me in this scenario, right? The person who runs it all. It is useful to have some part of the organization be the part that is aware of everything and allocates resources accordingly. Well, in you, in me, in all of us, one of those departments is consciousness, is thinking. And so when we say things like, I wish I knew exactly how many resources I had available to me, that's thinking, saying that I would like an awareness of everything available to me. And the whole reason that we don't is because if we did, then thinking would be like, well, there's more for me to use. I'll just keep using more. Like, I know that I'm getting close to death here, but I'm looking at the margins and we can afford to push a little harder. Like, no.
Yeah.
We want thinking to think that like you are out of resources well before we get into actual like physical danger. Thinking is not supposed to be working, like the job that thinking does is not a job related to in the moment survival. It's related to making things theoretically better for us in the future. So it should only be fed excess surplus resources. All like survival stuff has to be taken care of. And then whatever's above that, then we can toss that over to thinking. So whenever we're saying like, I wish I knew what we had, it's all we're saying is like, well, I don't understand why those other processes would need that amount of resources. And if I knew how much resources I had and I could use them more and push myself harder, then I don't see what the downside would be. And then you die because of course you don't understand intellectually the benefit of everything that your body is doing.
Yeah.
Yes, our culture, we have flip-flopped this stuff. Again, I genuinely think a lot of this has to do with
this family. Oh wait, hold on. But like stop thinking for a while, I could put my brain on autopilot, but I don't think my boss would be happy with me sleeping at my desk. Well, sleeping isn't. I was gonna say, sleeping isn't like putting your brain on autopilot. Although I guess you could say that it is. Like you, by definition, aren't thinking while you're asleep. That's what it means to be non-conscious, unconscious. There is no consciousness. But that's also not what. Actually, that's interesting. What I was gonna say there is that's not what we generally mean when we say like I want to stop thinking or I want to shut my brain off or whatever. What we generally mean is I want to be engaged in metacognition less. I want to be less aware of my thinking.
I feel like I was sleeping last night while also still thinking about thinking. And it was so confusing.
Oh man. So that gets into another like unsolvable philosophical problem,
Uh-huh.
which is levels of consciousness,
Uh-huh.
where like we can all agree that there is such a thing as being unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can all agree that there is such a thing as being conscious, you know. And we can all agree because we all experience that there are like varying degrees between those. It's not a binary like I am either not conscious or conscious. There's like on the way to sleep and on the way out of sleep. And even not necessarily with just sleep in particular. Throughout my day, there are times where I'm feeling less conscious or more conscious.
And it's complicated, and who knows what's real, because like again, this isn't like real stuff. This is meaning it does not exist in the real physical universe.
Right.
It's unobservable in that way. So it's just that's why it's a philosophical thing. But yes, you could argue. In fact, I have some of my own theories, and other people have some theories about some of this stuff. But you could argue that there's like, have you ever been knocked unconscious, or people have used anesthesia to put you unconscious?
Yes.
And like that experience is different than the experience of going to sleep.
Yes.
You know, like there's one moment and then there's the next moment and there's just nothing in
Yes.
between. Where generally that's not what sleep is like for people.
Mm-hmm.
You do get reports. I think this happened for me maybe one time, one night, but generally people don't actually like, I have fallen asleep and then when I wake up, it's as though no time has passed in between.
Yeah. Never.
And that doesn't mean that you're like waking up a bunch, although you are, everybody is, like this is part of the cycles of sleep. So anyway, that gets into a thing of like, we could argue that some people perhaps like cycle in different ways, or at least that at certain times, you know, one night versus another night, that like, you know, you're popping up into conscious or like a higher level of consciousness more frequently, or staying at a higher level of
I would love to sleep study on me last night then, because that was bizarre.
Well, the fun thing about this is like, you could theorize about the levels of consciousness, certainly. But one thing that seems useful to think about is memory of being conscious.
Mm-hmm.
It is at least theoretically possible to be conscious in such a way that nothing that you are conscious of encodes into memory long term or sticks in working memory, which would mean that like
In the very next moment, you wouldn't know that you had been conscious in the previous moment.
I don't like this.
So that's theoretically possible. But when it comes to sleep, especially, because I'll talk about like, you know, you're not conscious when you're asleep. And obviously we're saying there's some nuance to that. But people will be like, yeah, you're dreaming. And then I ask, what is the experience of a dream? How do you know that you dreamed? And the only real answer, the reason I can ask that question, no matter what people will say, it's because I was dreaming or whatever. The only true answer is because you remember having dreamed. Is that when you wake up at some point, at that point of being conscious, you have a memory in your conscious experience of having dreamed in a previous moment.
Yeah. I have so many moments where I'm in bed and I'm thinking about something so intensely, and then it goes away, and I go, what was I just thinking about so intensely? And I just have no memory. But it was 2 seconds ago, or so it feels. All the time.
And then you sometimes, very frequently, maybe not at the specific experience you're describing, but you very frequently then try to retrace your steps and say, like, what was I thinking?
And I can't.
Sometimes you can't. And those are the ones you're talking about. But there are all kinds of times where, like, what was I just thinking about? And then you can back up
Sure.
to some prior point
Yeah.
and go through the process. Of that. Right, that's what it was.
Yeah. It's the ones that I can't remember that scare me.
Yeah, what?
Why? It's obvious, Brandon. It's just scary.
Because having forgotten something is scary.
Because it seemed like it was so important, or like that there was
Was it?
I don't know, I guess not.
Well, it might have been, it might not have been.
I don't
but
know.
Important is just about your evaluation. So in one moment, you were behaving, you meaning all of the processes that constitute you, were behaving as though this thing was very important. In the next moment, you were behaving as though it was not important at all.
Yeah.
But you just automatically assumed the version of you that thought it was important was right, and the version of you that thought it wasn't was wrong. The more likely explanation would be that as you were treating it as important and thinking through it, something happened, something occurred to you, and your processes then shifted to be like, oh, never mind, they're not important. Go away.
I don't like that.
Yes, because what you're talking about is conscious control.
Yeah.
And that's what everybody is looking for. That is why I do not want to be aware of the actual resources I have available to me.
Yeah.
Because the part of us, whatever you want to call it, that exerts conscious control, makes us do things, is the dumbest part of us, right? Like, people will talk about, I was talking to my dad yesterday that he was watching some show where they were like, look, logic and rationality is not enough. You need passion too. And I agree with that statement. But more than that, it's like absurd that we center logic and rationality as though those things are inherently and exclusively good.
Mm-hmm.
Just remember that I think I have a 3 o'clock, so but I just got concerned. Yeah, no, it's a 3 o'clock. Just got concerned that I had remembered that wrong. I just figured in the context of the dream, it was absolutely essential that I remember the name of the bumblebee who gave me directions to the palace. Yeah, that happens for sure. No, logic and rationality are not inherently good things that are like almost enough all by themselves, and using them more is better and whatever. Logic and rationality, those are the things that allow us, those are the words we use to describe these concepts, these things that allow us to consider things which are not real.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That if I use logic to reach a conclusion, what that means is I am not observing a thing happening. I am thinking thoughts that allow me to project, well, this, then that, then this, then, oh, and here's the conclusion. And yes, that oftentimes that's like chronologically, I'm projecting what I think will happen in the future. But other times it's like purely abstract, right? That here's this abstract concept and here's this one. And I use logic to be like, oh, those are the same thing, or those connect in some way or are related to each other in some way. So it's really, really useful because by definition, what we're saying is everything which allows us to have any idea or awareness of anything which isn't currently real. Really useful. Also, by far, the lowest accuracy rate of anything that we do.
Our logic and
Yeah.
yeah.
Logic and rationality are much more vulnerable to any kind of inaccuracies or bad data or false premises than anything else, right? Like, if you throw a ball at me and I try and catch it, can that process go wrong and I miss it? Sure. But like, if you throw a ball at me and tell me to catch it and tell me that, like, by the way, this ball is actually 1 foot to the left of where you think that it is or whatever, I have to use logic to make my body do a thing that it wouldn't otherwise do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, logic, you can lie, and then good logic will get you bad conclusions. Good logic that starts with a false premise ends with a false conclusion, even though the logic is sound. Logic and rationality are like terrible accuracy rate. Of all the thoughts that you think, the percentage of those that we could label as like being accurate is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction.
Mm-hmm.
But we have flipped everything around and centered it as though that's the default and logic is correct, and that other things, like emotion and observation and impulse, those are the things that require justification. What do we mean by justification? We mean reasoning that logic utilizes. We're using logic to explain why we go to sleep. I use logic to determine
is it okay that I'm as tired as I am, as though that matters?
Mhm.
I'm as tired as I am, but am I really that tired, or
Right.
do I just feel tired, as though there's a difference? Tired is a thing you feel. I do actually think that this has a lot to do with, like, we keep, like, our systems were evolved over millennia to thrive in a very particular context, and we have obliterated that context. And I don't regret that, and I'm not advocating for anyone going back. I don't want to go back. I like having air conditioning and indoor plumbing. I like being able to talk as much as I'm able to talk and not have to worry about, like, walking around for 14 hours a day to try and find enough food to survive, you know? But because of logic and rationality, which has allowed us to innovate and develop new things, we start solving problems in advance of them being problems. That's what we mean by, like, when I'm saying food or whatever, like, I don't need to find food right now
Mhm.
because I am confident, for good reason, that systems exist that when it comes time for me to eat some food, I know where to get it and it's readily and easily available. Change that though. Make it so that a person now believes, like, I don't know if there's any food for me anywhere. And I can't sit here and talk to you about this right now. Like, until I know that there's some food, I can't be doing anything other than that. You know?
Mhm.
So we've solved all these problems to such a degree that, like, physical problems are not meaningful for us in the way that we are evolved for them to be. And we are engaging in cognition to an absurd degree that we were never meant to, and that it was not meant to be engaged in. And again, that doesn't mean it's bad. I like it. But it is very vulnerable. If we get a bad idea, if we get an inaccurate premise, then we start basing all of these things off of bad data and using good logic to arrive at false conclusions. All this is a very complicated way of saying things that people are kind of vaguely aware about, like saying I should do this is a problem. Should is a problematic thing.
Mhm.
That's that whole thing, right? That I've used logic to determine that this would be
Sure.
a preferable course of action. The logic is wrong all the time. And not even wrong in the sense of, like, I should do my homework, and no, you shouldn't do your homework in some grand sense. But as in, like, logic can say that it would be beneficial to do homework. Logic can even help you to determine, to what extent it would be or in what specific ways it would be valuable. And with the right information and the practice, can get good at determining what will it cost me in order to do that, and is it a good return on investment, which is an important addition that people mostly ignore. But none of that impacts that, like, in this moment, I don't have those resources available to me.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean that I physically, literally do not have those resources available to me, because that would be an absurd way to operate. You would die pretty quickly. It means that even though I technically have that money in the bank, it is all spoken for. It's all allocated. And if I were to say, like, oh yeah, I have $1,000, I can do this thing. Then tomorrow when the rent's due, it'd be like, oh crap, I am $1,000 short. So people are only focused on the value, not on the cost. Then even when they do start to think about the cost and balance out, like, opportunity cost, for example, would it be more efficient to spend these resources on some other thing instead? Sometimes, obviously, sometimes this is the most optimal thing for me to spend these resources on. Is the value worth the cost? Sometimes that's no, but sometimes yes, it is. And none of that changes that, like, you can afford the cost at sometimes and you can't, and logic can't do anything about that.
Mhm.
You can't logic extra resources up. And yeah, we are engaged in cognition all the time. It is good to, like, balance out things with physical activity. That doesn't necessarily mean working out, but, like, inhabiting your body and utilizing your body and directing attention at the physical environment and stuff. But also, realistically, the vast majority of us, especially those of us who are engaged in therapy processes or identify as being neurodivergent or who are intelligent, all that stuff, but pretty much everybody, we're going to spend the vast majority of our resources on cognition these days. Some of that cognition, a good chunk of it, we could discuss the proportion, should be enjoyable consumption, not active production.
Mhm.
You cannot produce a thing. If someone were to say to you like, "Oh, I want to be a filmmaker. I'm a director," and you're like, "Oh, what's one of your favorite movies?" They're like, "Oh, I've never watched a movie. I don't watch movies. I spend all my time trying to make movies." Then you immediately would be like, "Well, that's foolish. You should really watch some movies, like learn and be informed, right?" Yeah. Well, no, you should do your homework. You shouldn't play a video game. No, like there are different. We do have to. It is a big deal, and yes, it is something that's becoming more of a deal as time goes on and things shift. We have to provide cognitively oriented activities for ourselves that are net resource positive.
Mhm.
You have to like do things that generate resources for you, and that means things that are enjoyable. Yes, video games have become more popular over time, as has television and film and podcasts and radio and like all of these things we all engage in. If you talk to somebody from like 1820 about the extent to which we engage with any media of any kind, their minds would be blown, right? Like books used to be something that if your family had 5 books, you were rich. Like that's for real. People mostly didn't read. And now we just have buildings full of libraries or whatever, full of thousands and thousands of books that we mostly ignore. Like we go there when we go there, but a lot of people never go there. Like some human from the past would be like, "Are you kidding me?" Like,
Yeah.
people traveled the entire world to get to the Library of Alexandria, and it didn't have half the information that your library has.
Yeah, Google now too.
So yeah, it's a different thing. And for anybody who's trying to say like, well, the optimal way to navigate this context is surely the same as the optimal way to navigate the context from 40 years ago or 80 years ago or 200 years ago, that is just on the face of it an absurd statement to me. It'd be like, well, I grew up playing basketball and my kid's trying to play baseball and he really needs to learn how to dribble that ball. Like, no, that's a different.
Right.
It was valuable for what you were doing. That nobody's saying you're wrong because that's the defense, right? It's like, well, I did it that way and it really worked. Yes, it did. In that, do you really think the context is the same? If we're valuing cognition so highly, the whole point of cognition is about thinking about the future. Then isn't the point there? Isn't the underlying thing that we're all accepting is that it is useful to behave differently or do things differently? Innovation, right? Creativity. We value these things. But then sometimes we're like, no.
Brandon, there's an irony in what you're saying because I'm sitting here thinking about how my teachers are like, pick a theory that resonates with you and how you conceptualize people and the way they think and the way they do things and the way they develop and how hard that is for me to like, it makes up systems and ideas of the way people think. And I hear you speak, I'm like, oh my God, he knows. He has figured out these like ideas of like when this happens. And I don't know. It's,
well, no, what? Keep going.
and I'm thinking about like, man, like what a bummer, Olivia, that you can't, like, you don't have a way of conceptualizing like Brandon does. But then we're also talking about cognition and like it's not always a great thing. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Not that it's great or not great.
Yeah.
It's just that it is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's useful to know what it is instead of thinking or acting as though it's something different than what it is.
Yeah.
And yes, your response to that is both that part I just jumped in on, but the other part about like, what a bummer that you can't. It's still through that lens of some things are good and some things are bad.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you're looking at in me that you're like, wow, that's cool and impressive and interesting or whatever, is the thing that I'm trying to talk about. This idea of it's not that things are good or bad, right? Like you put this juxtaposition there of like learn theories from past thinkers and whatever, with a connotation that like that's silly and bad to learn from the past. But like Brandon has all this good stuff and that's good to learn. No, it's all, again, because people think good or bad, they think when I acknowledge limitations of something like education, that means it's bad and we shouldn't do it, or that I think that it's, and that's not the case at all. Education is amazing. Again, like people take a very, very narrow view,
Mhm.
and they're just looking at like what is their concept of education now compared to what they think it was before, what it could be differently. But nobody's going back even 100 years, much less 1,000, 2,000, whatever, to like at any point in human history, if you had said this is an option of something that you could do, I'd be like, yes, please, like
Mhm.
take me to that. I want to go to school all day long, every day, and that's my job. That sounds amazing, right? We just don't have the context to compare. So it has its limitations. That doesn't mean it's not valuable. And the value in academic learning to me is communication, community. People, humans, we do best when we specialize and work well with one another. And so writing and writing is the key, but other various forms of being able to, for one human to communicate with other humans on a mass scale, both across space and time, is amazing. Not because everything that Freud wrote is brilliant and true, it should never be questioned or built upon or advanced forward or whatever, but because if somebody reaches some conclusions over the course of their life, and then you can get that conclusion to start and build from there, you get farther instead of you having to spend your whole career just coming to the same conclusion that somebody else already spent their career coming to.
Mhm.
The point of being handed all that stuff is here is to the best of our collective ability to do, to the best of our ability, we have determined what is the best stuff, the most valuable stuff that has been created. And we're presenting it all to you so that you get a foundation and you don't have to waste your time rediscovering any of this stuff.
Mhm.
Now you can go spend your career improving upon it,
Mhm.
making it better. Unfortunately, because of various factors, but right now I'm going to just sum it all up as this idea that everything's good or bad. In fact, what happens is that we're taught these things as this is the correct stuff to know, and anything that is different than this is bad and incorrect, which is the exact opposite of what education is supposed to be. The idea that you should learn how to do it the way they did it, and if you do it any differently, you're doing it badly.
Mhm.
It makes sense why people have come to that place. There's all kinds of steps along the way. It's understandable why we're there. But it is an unfortunate place to end up, that you're taught that what other people figured out in the past is right, and anything you would do that is different is bad. It's terrible.
Yeah, that's terrible.
And that's the thing you're talking about to me is
Yeah,
like,
that's
I
terrible.
can learn from the things that other people do and say without evaluating is this right or wrong.
Yeah.
It is valuable by definition, or it wouldn't exist. Nobody has ever come up with a concept that there was no function or value in developing that concept. And no concept has ever become widespread or persisted over time that didn't have value to a lot of people that continued to make sure that it spread and survived.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean it's perfect, but you take it for what it is, you take the value in it, and then you build on it. You find some limitations, you change some things, you iterate, you throw away some stuff, but you do it from that perspective of understanding why it exists.
It makes me think of acting school and preparing a monologue, and how sometimes it was so overwhelming to think of all the different approaches and methods I've learned, and how am I going to approach this monologue and perform it. And I guess it's the same thing happening here. I just didn't put that connection together. Like I had that same thing happen when working on a damn monologue. Yeah.
That attempt to consciously control everything. That's why it makes you afraid when you forgot something.
Mhm.
We talk about working memory as an executive subfunction. One of the executive functions, divided up, is working memory. And people mostly focus on that because everybody, same thing, good or bad. Either my working memory is good or it is bad, as though it's bigger or smaller,
Mhm.
including officially in terms of like how tests and evaluations look at it. It's like, what's the size of your working memory? Which is absurd. It's not actually a space, obviously. Like that's just a metaphor we're using to talk about this thing. The only thing we can actually measure is a person's ability to retain something in working memory over some period of time.
Mhm.
Right? Like I say 3 letters to you and then ask you what those letters were 10 minutes later. Do you remember? All we're saying is you became aware of something, and then you were asked to utilize or produce that information at some later point without having any intervening opportunity to get the information again. So the only way you can still have access to it is by having held it in consciousness all along the way.
Mhm.
So rather than talking about it as larger or smaller, the more useful way to talk about it is a person's ability to make it, to consciously determine that something in there should stay in there,
Mhm.
and how long can they make that happen.
Mhm.
So what you're doing there, even if the actual thoughts you were having were completely unimportant, we could still say that what it is skill development. You are practicing just holding something in working memory.
Mhm.
And so by definition, part of what you would then experience when it falls out of working memory is some sense of failure or loss.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any attempts to hold on to it. That doesn't mean that you have done some terrible thing. That's the
Right.
part that you're adding on, that it's bad. It's not what you were trying to do.
Is that ever gonna go away? The thinking like bad, good, right, wrong.
In particular domains, because as with the like stopping thinking, well,
We've got a lot.
I had a therapist who, from the first session, jumped on anytime I said should, and I don't think it did anything but make detours to find other words to express the same thing because I didn't want a should lecture. Made me start taking detours. Yeah, we as a society have gotten to a point where we can completely forget Freud. We can just never think about him again. We've moved beyond Freud. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, except we haven't. Not only, I don't mean that as in like some of his thoughts haven't been improved upon, although there's certainly at least some truth to the idea that like his thoughts as he recorded them are still useful to some extent. But for a separate reason, which happens with people like Freud all the time, which is that for us to be able to learn and remember and communicate concepts, we anthropomorphize them. So associating certain ideas or things with Freud and then talking about Freud is a way to communicate those ideas and have those ideas proliferate. I genuinely think it's the same reason we have celebrities or superheroes, or what the aristocracy was part of the function that they served. You know, that as a large community, large scale community where we don't have a lot of touch points, you know, what's similar in my life to what's similar to somebody who does a different profession and lives in Oklahoma or whatever, like there's not that much in common besides some language, except for the large scale culture stuff. So it's useful to have those common. Can't we just pick someone else? Well, this would fall under kind of a euphemistic drift thing. Whoever else we picked, and we have a bunch of them. I could list them all.
It's like young or an elephant.
No, I shouldn't say I could list them all. I could list a bunch of others that we have picked. Those people, if we used them to the same extent and in the same way that we used Freud, you would just become annoyed with those people instead. Freud has become a representative of a thing more than it is about like who the person. Nobody knows, myself included. Nobody knows Freud. He was a dude, like whatever. We're talking about some ideas and concepts and things that he represents.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that we can sit and talk about the Kardashians or Brad Pitt or
Mm-hmm.
Billie Eilish or whatever, and none of us are talking about an actual person. We're using that
Fascinating
person
trio you
to
just
represent some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to pick modern cultural things. I don't know. Yeah, Jung is certainly up there. But yeah, I don't know. Like any philosopher that has come to represent a certain thing, you get annoyed eventually because people use it. Well, have you even read Nietzsche? Like, that's a dumb way to talk about Nietzsche, but it's useful to have that concept, that person, that name.
Sounds like you're sneezing when you say his name.
Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm mispronouncing it. I don't know. Sure, but I have a particular dislike for Freud. Well, of course, that's part of the function he serves is to be hated.
Right.
Just like part of the function that many celebrities serve is for us to all talk about how much that they suck. Like in the realm of psychology, Freud occupies that role of like, okay, amateurs know about him and like him, but those of us who know a little bit more know that actually he kind of sucks in ways that most people don't know. But then if you learn a little bit more, it's like there's more nuance to it than that. And so I personally also have a particular dislike for the way that Freud is discussed or the concepts like that people associate with Freud. Even though, for example, like a Freudian slip has real merit as an idea, the thing everyone's talking about now as a Freudian slip and the way people use it now is just absurd. Same with like the subconscious. The idea he was talking about is valid and useful, but what people think about and talk about as the subconscious now is terrible. I just hate that people keep quoting him all the time, like it being a Freud quote makes it good. Yeah, well, again, this is a credibility thing, right? Where like people will take quotes and be like, Albert Einstein said this, and like, no, he didn't. But we're just playing this game, right? I'm trying to get a point across to you, and I believe that if you think that it's Albert Einstein said it, then I think you'll pay
I
more
like
attention to
Things
it.
in quotes, but anonymous.
Yeah, quotes are a whole fun thing too. Anyway, all this stuff it's whatever, and I gotta get going. But you asked if will it ever go away?
Yeah.
No, in the same way that you can't stop thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the issue is that people trying to get yourself to stop doing something is something you would only do if what?
It was a bad thing.
If it's a bad thing.
God damn it.
So the attempt to stop yourself from doing, to exert conscious control, to make yourself stop doing something, relies on that you have identified that thing as being bad. But you wouldn't be doing it if the processes that constitute you
Served me in some way.
producing that for you was believed at least, and we believe we do things that are erroneous all the time, but that yes, that there was some value in it. So focusing on stopping things is the wrong way to go about doing stuff.
Okay.
Because whatever you're doing it for a reason. If there's something else that you think would be even better to do, then you want to look at that and try and get yourself focused in that direction, prioritize those things more. But trying to get yourself stopped, it's like trying to get out of quicksand by digging your way out. Like anything you take out is immediately replaced and you're just wasting your energy. So it will cease to happen. You can't stop doing it, but it will only cease to happen in particular domains. In other words, good and bad is a duality.
Mm-hmm.
The minimum you can know about something is nothing. You have no awareness of it. It's just not a thing you've ever heard of or know exists. The next minimum you can spend on something is to know it as a single static thing. It is what it is, right? Love is a thing that exists or whatever, right? The next is to split it into two things. Well, sure, there's day, but there's also night. It's not always the same. So at any given time, the vast majority of concepts are concepts of which you have no awareness. Then of all the concepts that you have some awareness of, the vast majority of them are just a thing you know exists and is something, whatever the thing is that you know it to be. Then a much smaller amount of things are things that you know that there's two options for, and you're considering those binary. And then there's things where there's three and there's four and whatever. So in any specific area, in any specific domain, as you get more information, then the good and the bad idea goes away because it's just more complicated than that. There's more to it than that. And you already do that in all kinds of places, right? Like if you were to go to a play with someone and they were like, do you think that person's performance was good or bad? You'd be like, well, that's not, I wouldn't use those terms to discuss it. There are things I like and things I found to be effective and things not, whatever. But you can also at the same time know that for most people, just saying like, oh, that was a good show or a bad show is fine.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wrong or dumb for thinking of it that way. It just hasn't been useful to them to spend the resources necessary to think about it in more complexity. So you stop thinking about what's good and what's bad as you become more aware of further options beyond just two.
Yeah,
But you can't make yourself stop thinking about it.
that's helpful.
Either quote my address a little way. But he never actually even said it. I'm running every Freud quote through Quote Investigator. Just had a good article over the weekend about why the author drift did happens. He's a quote magnet. Yeah, well, same as Einstein, right? Anybody, it's a credibility thing. And we overweight intelligence and psychology and consciousness just generally. So we've identified certain people, Freud, Einstein, or whatever. It's like these are the people that represent the pinnacle of cognition. That, and so because we worship cognition, we then utilize these things that represent cognition as a way to lend credibility to anything. Like have your baby listen to classical music and their IQ will go up. Like
Baby Einstein, that was a big thing for a while.
Yeah. Anybody have any direct relevance of like what IQ means and how would you know and all that? Whatever. But we just say, hey, do this and you'll be smarter. And we're like, okay, I'll do it. Because smart is good. Anyway, goodbye everybody. Be here next
Bye.
week, same time.
Author drift.